The following is a recording of a real poker coaching session. To find out more about available coaching packages and courses, head to pokerfluency.com today. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the video. Let's talk through some of these hands in the hand review document. Let me just bring them up so that I can view them while we're talking.
I had a couple of quick hands maybe before we end today.
Sure. Let's
12 and 14. It were just quick hands pre-flop situation with ace king in both cases.
Yeah, there's a couple of them that are not really, there's not really a ton to talk about, but there's also a couple of them that there's a lot to talk about. So I think that is where we want to start. And the one that I want to start with, if I just scroll down to it, is the Jack 10 offsuit hand. This one right here.
Number 7.
Yeah, so number 7 here, the hand where we have Jack 10 offsuit pre. Now,
yeah, I went a little overboard on the analysis there. I
don't think the analysis is the problem. I don't think the analysis is the issue here. I think the issue is, first of all, there's a few things, right? The first thing is the logic of pre-flop, right? Is that we want to really be mindful of, first of all, the priority of the game that you're in, or the defining factor of the game that you're in, playing 1-2, is the rake is high. And that colors every part of your strategy. So not only can we not call Jack 10 offsuit in middle position here at 75 big blinds deep, but I don't think you should have any calling range here in this spot. I don't think you can in those games. I think that it's almost implausible to have an opponent opening under the gun that is making enough mistakes post that the rake is offset by the fact that they're making mistakes, right? So I think the first thing here is just we shouldn't have any calling range. So I'm just going to make a note here. Should not have a MP calling range here. Rake is too high. So that is the first thing. Second thing, you're absolutely right that calling with offsuit broadways is not recommended, and this call is too wide for sure. This hand is, even if you do have a calling range, this hand is way too wide. It's 3 pips too wide, right? Like ace jack off, like I could maybe understand trying to put money in the pot with here. Jack 10 off, way too wide. But what I really want to drill into is this logic here, right? This is 1-2, and this player is tight passive. So I want to play hands with it and try to outplay him post flop. What does outplaying him post flop mean to you in this?
When I have spots where it didn't happen on this board, or when I have spots where overcards come, that type of a thing, getting aggressive. If he checks to me, or being aggressive and just bluffing and trying to take him off the hand. They call this particular player is going to overfold in turn and river spots.
Okay.
So that's my. Yeah.
Okay. So that's a bit of a better definition there in terms of they're going to be overfolding in turn or river spots. But I think the thing that we want to keep in mind here is the hand that we have and how the hand that we have actually correlates with what we're trying to accomplish here. Because if the goal is we're expecting him to overfold post flop, right? Or we're expecting to see too many folds on turns and rivers. We're expecting to be able to bluff more effectively. We're going to over-realize, another way to put it is we're going to over-realize our equity with the bottom of our range, right? We're going to make more money than we're supposed to with hands that are towards the bottom of our range. We're going to want to have hands that are favorable for being able to take bluff lines with, right? And that means that if we are going to have hands that call here pre, it's going to be hands that have the ability to play aggressively post flop from in position in a greater variety of situations, right? And in fairly simple terms, the category of hands that's going to fit with that is going to be hands that are able to flop draws, right? Hands that have the ability to flop straight draws, flush draws, things like that, that we can use to bluff with, right? And then on top of that, you've also got to consider the card removal aspects of this particular type of hand, in that high card, Broadway cards, things like that. Let me just let the note taker in. Broadway card type hands are the exact type of hands that we think our opponent might have when they're going to be overfolding post flop, right? We are going to want them to have hands like, I don't know, ace jack, ace 10, or whatever combinations of hands are going to be the hands that they're going to overfold with on some board textures, Jack 10 offsuit is going to interact with some of them, right? So if we were going to expand our range here, we want it to be with hands that benefit from what we're trying to achieve. Expanding our range needs to be done with hands that fit what we're trying to do.
So that means again how the interplay with the Broadway hands is.
So if we think villain's going to overfold, right? It makes sense that where the types of hands that they're going to have that are towards the bottom of their pre-flop range are going to also be towards the bottom of their range or towards the middle of their range on a variety of post-flop textures. Logically, the hands that are towards the bottom of their opening range under the gun here, it's going to be their king jacks, their ace jacks, ace tens, hands like that. And those are going to be the hands that if they're going to overfold on post-flop textures, it's likely to be the case that it's going to be the ace highs, the Broadway cards, the hands that are supposed to speculatively check call the flop or supposed to c-bet the flop or something like that. It's going to be those weaker portions of their pre-flop range that are going to overfold, right? The overfold has to come from somewhere, and it's less likely that they're going to overfold with pocket pairs. It's more likely that they're going to overfold with hands that have some kind of Broadway cards. Now, that's a minor factor here, and I don't want to go too far into the weeds of this because the reality is that you shouldn't flat any hand here.
The question I have is that what you said before that you didn't repeat is how we want to interact with those hands.
Right.
We want to not have Broadways, or we want to...
Right. We want to generally have low card suited hands that benefit from being able to bluff across multiple streets, because then the hands that our opponent's going to have that are higher card hands are going to be folding, right? We simply want
unblock the Broadway.
Exactly. We want to unblock as much of the high card Broadway type stuff as possible. And then the other thing, of course, is what we haven't considered here, or what we need to consider, is that this definition of tight passive, it does mean, first and foremost, that if your opponent is fairly tight and they're opening under the gun, they probably have a very tight range to begin with, right? So it would make much more sense to try to play more hands against them in situations where at least we might consider that they have a somewhat wider pre-flop range. So maybe they are potentially opening from middle position and we're on the button, something like that. But when they're opening under the gun, and not only do we face an under the gun open, but we also have multiple players left to act behind us, this is just not the spot where we really have much opportunity to start expanding our range, right? Pre-flop is definitely a mistake. That's the first thing here. Like, pre-flop is definitely way too wide, and we probably shouldn't have much of a calling range at all here. But we go to the flop, and the actual flop decision is fairly trivial here in that we obviously can't fold. We flop top pair. It's not an ideal spot for us because our hand is basically a bluff catcher and isn't going to really improve very often. They do have, I think that they are betting some hands that we're ahead of here, but we do need to be more specific with the way that we categorize this range here, because stuff like to list, let's say, backdoor flush draw in here, right? We have to be very specific when villain is opening under the gun. What combos of backdoor flush draw hands can they have here that are opening under the gun and don't also have some kind of a pair on this board, right? Because the backdoor here is the clubs. We have the 10 of clubs, so they can't have ace 10 of clubs, king 10 of clubs, queen 10 of clubs, and queen 10 of clubs already has a gut shot anyway. So I would venture to say that the only backdoor flush draw hands that they can potentially have here are ace king of clubs, ace queen of clubs, king queen of clubs, maybe like ace 9 of clubs, maybe some other ace x of clubs like ace 5 or ace 4. But we want to be careful about labeling this as an overall category, because there's really only a few hands that fit into this definition. And yet we're also including other definitions here that are very generalized here, where we say second pair here. What second pair hands does villain have? They're opening under the gun. Maybe they can occasionally have 8-7 suited, stuff like that, but we already labeled them as tight passive. So how many hands like that do they really have? So we basically I don't think that you're wrong about any of this in terms of villain potentially being able to bet these categories of hands, but we need to be more specific about what hands are in these categories here, because some of them are a decent chunk of hands, and some of them are almost no hands. And in particular, top pair weak kicker, like this right here, where you've already listed everything Jack 10 suited plus, and a tight passive player here at 1-2, we probably would need a bit more information to think that they would be opening like Jack 9 suited. So we went straight into this category here, but I actually don't think there's anything in this category in their range.
I ran this in Flopzilla.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to take a look at it, but I saved the file. If I ran in Flopzilla, the range that I gave them, and but I was probably incorrect on what I assumed they would have here. I gave them, but still 77 combos, like you say, is pretty wide for them to be.
Yeah, and it's also just not really that necessary to start thinking about numbers of combos at this point in our hand. There isn't really a clear equation as far as how many combos we need them to have or anything like that. So I think that in terms of like where you direct your energy here, I think what you want to be thinking about as far as how to evaluate their range here is pretty much considering that their bet size is fairly big, 11 into 15. We want to start with what's the value range here, right? And they clearly have a lot of value hands here that we've established. I'm not really sure why we say it's 7 combos of jacks, 8s, and 6s, because it's actually 9. It's 3 combos.
So we block the jack, don't we?
Oh, we do. Of course, you're right. Sorry, never mind. But yeah, regardless of that, the sets, overpairs, yeah, top pair, those are all very reasonable. That's the strong portion of the range here. But we also, I think what's interesting is you were very specific about the value region, and then you were very generalized about the bluffing region. You went, these are the exact value hands that they can have that beat us. And then we went, these are all the general categories of hands that we're ahead of. And in fact, a lot of these hands are either not really present in the range much at all, or we don't have full confidence that they're actually going to bet the flop.
I gave them Jack 9 suited. I think what was the top pair weak kicker suited.
The thing about that is that just isn't really particularly consistent with the read that they're tight passive and they're opening under the gun. So this is the thing that we want to make sure that our understanding or our read on our opponent is consistently applied throughout the hand. And in this case, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, they're tight passive, but then we're starting to add more hands into their range than what might be.
Would it be worthwhile to look at the range I used from Flopzilla?
Probably not, because this is...
I just pulled the 77 combos right out of Flopzilla. I just clicked on all the draws that he could possibly have here that are realistic, all the way down to backdoor flush draws.
Yeah, I don't think it's really... Flopzilla is not really a tool that's especially useful these days, because it helps you to enumerate ranges in that way, but it's going to lead you down avenues like this where we're being very generalized about different categories of hands. And I think we want to try to be more specific if we're going to enumerate. We either have to be specific in terms of how we enumerate the hands in the range, or we're just looking at classes of hands in a more generalized way, in which case we want to generally categorize together some of these some of this value region, right? We don't.
And how should I be thinking in game? I'm not going to have a computer in front of me. So how am I thinking in game in terms of I can enumerate his value, but the bluffs are, it's very nebulous here at this point.
Yeah. And I think you want to recognize in game that there's not really, at this point on the flop, like nothing is really a bluff yet, right? There's a few combos that maybe towards the bottom of the range that might be best categorized as pure bluffs. But if we think that hands like second pair, flush draw, stuff like that are in their range, then I think we just have to account for an overall understanding of what this range looks like. And it's relatively polar in the sense that it's about a 2/3 pot bet. It's probably somewhat value heavy, probably somewhat equity driven. And I don't think we really need to go much beyond that at this point, because we're still in the early stages of the hand here. We still recognize that our hand has clearly far too much equity to fold. We clearly can't just fold top pair on the flop here. So the enumeration process at this point, other than to have a fairly general idea of the broad categories of hands that are in the value range, and then the categories of hands that are likely to be potential bluffs here, I don't think we need to go too much further than that, because ultimately this 77 combos, this is basically the upper limit of how many bluffs might exist, right? If they bet all of the hands that fit these categories 100% of the time, they might total up to 77 combos, right? But we have so much lack of confidence about how often they're actually betting these combos, the amount of actual quote unquote bluffs that they have here could be anywhere between about 20 combos and this 77.
But Matt, if we cut his, I'm sorry to keep interrupting.
Okay.
If there, do you mind if I comment or just?
Of course, go ahead.
That's
Always
fine.
comment. Yeah.
Yeah. So if we cut his, because I spent a lot of time trying to do the math over and over again. When pot odds is something we all understand, but rarely use or should use more often. But anyway, if we cut down the number of combos, then it's tipping the scale to value. And we still have, then we have a kind of a dubious call with Jack 10 here. We have some equity. We have a pair, but we're not beating any of his value except for with Jack 10, we're chopping. So is that lean us towards folding here?
No, I think the missing ingredient here is that even a range that's leaning towards value, we can't have so much confidence that we can simply just fold right away. And then we also, because we have a jack, we have to account for the fact that value range is only 37 combos based on the hand that we have. So even if, to give you a clue, to give you just an idea here, even if this was 37 combos of value and only 20 combos of bluffs, because we're only facing less than pot here and we're in position, we only need to realize, like, you correctly identified here that we need to realize approximately 30% equity here. Like, we don't really need to be able to find very many bluffs here. The only point at which we would start to consider, to even vaguely consider folding here, is if we think they only have value, right? Because even against some of their value, we still have equity. We still have outs to make two pair against ace jack, king jack, queen jack, etc. We have a backdoor straight draw too. Yeah. So it's just
hung up on that 2.5 to 1, what his bluffing frequency should be. And if he's not bluffing enough, then we start folding.
The thing is that the thing is that pot odds don't apply in that much of a direct way on the flop, because all of his bluffs have equity. All of your bluff catchers have equity to improve to be better than a bluff catcher.
Sure.
So this kind of the pot odds equation here, in terms of how much equity you need to realize and things like that, right, on the flop or on the turn, you only want to use it in a very generalized way to understand approximately what kind of price you're getting. And this type of equation here, we can't do these equations on the flop. You can't do the equations about this type of thing. And let me just finish here. The second thing is that even if we could do these calculations on the flop, this sentence right here, we need him to have roughly 90 bluffs here for our call to be based on, to be break even based on the odds that he's laying. This is actually totally backwards in that this is the opposite application of pot odds. What you're doing is you are saying we need him to have 2.5 bluffs for every one value bet. But in fact, the equation is we only need to find one bluff for every 2.5 value bets. So if it was true that we could look at this and say, this is the number of combos that we need to find in the range, the number would not be 90. The number would actually be something in the region of about 14 or 13 or something like that.
Right. I had that completely backwards. Yeah.
That's what you're missing here. So this is the reason why we can't ever think about folding here, right? It doesn't need to be 90 bluffs. It needs to be like some kind of bluffs. If we have any kind of vague approximation of a region of bluffs that exists, we can't fold. So that's why we can't, even against someone who is value heavy, which most opponents are going to be here, particularly at 1-2, we just can't fold. Like, we just continue, like you flop top pair, you just call, like you continue to the next street. Like, it's extremely rare that we can ever justify folding top pair on the flop. And certainly to less than a pot size bet, it's almost impossible in most cases. We just continue here and we go to the turn. And there's nothing about this flop decision that is out of the ordinary, but in particular, it is noteworthy here that if it was the case that villain was value heavy enough that we would ever consider folding top pair here on this board, then there's definitely no way that we can call wide and try to outplay in post flop, right? Because it just has too strong of a range. So we do have to bear that in mind here. So generally, in terms of how you actually play this flop, the play is fine, the call is fine, but some of the logic is a little bit off because we don't have to go into the number of combos. And even if we did, we actually don't really need to find that many bluffs at all, right?
I'm glad I incorrectly laid this out, because I really needed to get straightened out on this. It's just the backwards thinking on the math.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that might be influencing some of your thinking in a lot of spots, honestly, because I think that if we have the math backwards like that, it's going to naturally make us feel like I need to find all these different kinds of bluffs in order to continue here or in order to bluff catch. But in fact, you correctly identified that you only need 30% equity to break even. But if it was true that they had 37 combos of value and 90 combos of bluffs, you would have 80% equity here. Like your equity would be super high. So we got to be careful about that one.
Yeah, that's great.
Cool. So turn is a 5 here. Under the gun remains uncapped. 5 doesn't change much. Yeah, exactly. It's interesting you say probably doesn't have 5s for a set, because you already did say low pairs are part of this range. So we always, again, we have to make sure that everything matches up. If you believed that on the flop he was betting low pairs, then 5s is a small part of his range at this point. So it is present. He certainly has a bunch of hands that beat us. Nothing that was beating us on the flop is no longer beating us. But again, the number of combos exactly doesn't really matter. He may also continue to bet with some, see, this is some stuff that we have to be as clear as possible about here, because there's a big difference between how much possibility there is that he continues betting with this category, flush draws, open-enders, gut shots, which if he does have those here, yes, it's plausible that he can continue those. And it certainly is reasonable to think that he would at some frequency. But there are only a few gut shots and open-enders and flush draws that exist in his range based on pre-flop, particularly the gut shots and open-enders. There aren't that many of them. And then it's also interesting here that I think we identified, and I think it's correct to identify this, that he probably is not betting the turn with 10s, but we did say he may continue to bet with top pair, weak kicker, weak pair. Like, this is too general of a region. Weak pair. What does this mean, really? But on the one hand, we're saying there might be some weak top pair and some, maybe, I guess you mean like middle pair type stuff here.
No, weak pair was maybe like bottom pair.
Okay, but what hand is that? Bottom pair here is a 5, which means what hands can he have that just has a 5? Ace 5 suited, maybe specifically.
I have 4s here, 3s and 4s.
I mean, you said low pairs on the flop, but I don't think he opens them under the gun to begin with.
Okay.
Basically, you either have to, if you're thinking about a category of hands, you have to consider how, in a general sense, how likely is that category of hands, or what hands within that category do exist. And then if you're thinking about specific hands, you have to be specific. But what you're doing here is you're taking very generalized categories of hands and you're applying them in a very specific way, right? Like, you're taking overall categories of hands and then you're saying this is the number of combos, and that's doing both at the same time. And it's gonna get confusing, because this number
that's
of
right.
combos,
He only has 6s. He doesn't have just the 5s.
Yeah, but even beyond that, like, this number of combos is not roughly 34 combos. This is anywhere between 10 and 34 combos. So there's a wide variation in possibilities that could exist here. And then you also mentioned weak pair here, but then you put under pairs to the board here. So clearly, when you said weak pair, you weren't thinking about deuces, 3s, 4s, right? Because these two categories, if this means deuces, 3s, and 4s, what does this mean?
Jesus, I'm going to stop annotating these hands here.
I just mean that you want to either be specific or you want to be generalized, and you don't want to apply the very specific numbers of combos in situations where you're talking about, general categories of hands, right? And again, when we get to the turn here, we face this bet of 30. I do think this is where our hand starts to be a little bit dicier. I think we're basically bluff catching at this point, and I think it's fine to continue here. Again, we have top pair. It's really hard to just fold top pair here to a bet of less than pot. But again, we also got this backwards here. We don't need to have 85 bluffs. Oops, where are we? Also backwards. There we go. So I could understand a fold here. I really could. I think it would be reasonable or not outside the box to identify. I think the villain is probably a bit value heavy. My hand is just a bluff catcher. I don't really have much opportunity to improve now. It would be reasonable to fold here. And you're right that probably has less bluffs here than on the flop, because some of the bluffs that bet the flop are going to fall off out of the range a little bit on the turn here. The one thing I would say though is that I think there's two things here. He has about the same amount of hands that beat us. I think we have to account for the fact that some portion of the flop value range isn't guaranteed to bet the turn, in that let's say villain does bet the flop with all of the Jack 10 suited plus here. A hand like Jack 10 suited, Queen Jack suited, those hands are certainly not strong enough to just be like, oh, I want to get 3 streets here with this hand. So we do probably want to account for the fact that some of that value region on the flop is likely to slow down at some.
What specifically do you
range.
mean? Maybe he's probably doesn't have Jack 9. We chopped to Jack 10, but he's still betting Queen Jack.
I guess what I'm saying is that the confidence level is lower, right? So Ace Jack, we have pretty high confidence that there's a high likelihood that he would continue. King Jack, probably approximately the same, maybe a little bit less confidence. Queen Jack, it could be 50-50. Jack 10, I actually think Jack 10, if it bets the flop here, it's probably not going to bet this size on the turn.
Sure.
Because it's quite hard to see what
Right.
Jack 10 can really get called by that's worse. So I would probably say we just have to apply this. It's like a progression from Ace Jack is in there at a high frequency. Jack 10 is in there. We can't rule it out completely, but it's in there at a low frequency, right? And then it's just a linear scale like that. We're also going to, some of the flop bluffs are going to slow down. Some of the draws, I think we probably can expect to slow down as well, especially some of the draws that potentially turn one pair. So something like an Ace 5 of diamonds could potentially slow down to some degree here. But broadly speaking, I think the assumption is pretty good here. The only thing that's really incorrect necessarily on the turn is just this assumption here. It's just the backwards pot odds, right? Now, the river is interesting here because the river is now a point where we actually can start to look at the number of combos and things like that, right? And there are ways to do it in more specific terms, but I think the starting point, or the easiest starting point for any kind of river bluff catching spot, is we have to establish what the value threshold is, right? What's the weakest hand that if villain did get here with that hand in some way that they could bet for value here? And I would say it probably is somewhere around King Jack. I think it would probably be somewhere around that area. Considering the size here is quite small, it's less than half pot, I think that we don't necessarily need to assume that it's a super polarized range. I think it can include some value bets that are perhaps a little bit on the thinner side, like King Jack. Queen Jack, probably a bit more difficult to see Queen Jack going for 3 streets here. Jack 10, again, we don't think that if Jack 10 did bet the turn here, it's hard to see it going for a 3rd street. So I would probably put the value threshold at about King Jack plus, which obviously means that our hand is a bluff catcher in that it does not beat any value. So we are basically just looking at a pot odds decision here in terms of potential bluffs that might exist in the range. You're correct here that we need 24% equity. We are getting a very good price here. And we obviously could make an exploitative call. We would be reasonable to make that call here. I would probably say here that when you start to account for the potential bluffs that did exist on the earlier streets, like if we were thinking that villain can have enough bluffs on the earlier streets that we decided we were going to continue here and we get to this river card, I think versus this size, it's really difficult to fold a jack because it's just, the region of value is not that extensive. Like even if it's all King Jack plus, there just aren't that many of those hands in existence here. If we looked at, let's say, that 37 combos, like we're getting better than 3-1, we would only need something like 13 combos of bluffs. And it might not be unreasonable to think that those bluffs would exist. I would probably be pretty reluctant to fold top pair, getting a pretty good price here. But if we do get here but basically if you get here with top pair on this board and you don't feel like you can call, it's very unlikely that the pre-flop call was profitable, right? If something's going to happen where your opponent it has a tight enough range here, or has an overall strategy that has value heavy enough that we have top pair on this board and we end up not being able to call a river bet, then we're probably not doing very well with the pre-flop call. So I don't think that flop or turn is necessarily a mistake. I think river fold is probably pretty tight. But I think overall, the main thing that I wanted to highlight from this hand is we want to make sure that we're enumerating these ranges in the right ways and we don't get too hung up on numbers of combos. And then we want to really make sure that we don't have this pot odds equation inverted. We don't want to be thinking that we need to find all these bluffs when in fact we don't need to find many. So
Matt, so we can wait till like river to start enumerating combos as long as we know where the value range is, and
I think
we get the ratios correct.
And I think it's easier to, on the earlier streets, because there's so much ambiguity a lot of the time, like you don't really have that much clarity on how your opponent's overall strategy is constructed on the earlier streets. To account for that ambiguity, we don't have to start that enumeration process, and we can just think broadly about overall classes of hands that can exist within the range here. So what I would probably want to do with each of these as a sort of a stopgap way here to enumerate, but also account for the hand classes, is with each of these classes of hands, we might label. So for example, open-ended straight draw is 10-9 suited, right? Or we would just label specifically what gut shots do they have. So queen 10 suited is basically the only one here, right? They don't have 9-7 or queen 9 suited in range. They don't really have 4-5.
I originally enumerated all the hands because I counted them, but I didn't want to get too lengthy.
Sure. Yeah, that's totally fair. And I think that as long as we can account for how wide each of these categories actually is, right? Because it's definitely important that when we say flush draw here, that we understand, is that 10 combos of hands or is it 30 combos of hands, right? And in this spot, it's probably closer to 10 combos of hands. So
still from flop, turn, and river, we're still trying to enumerate the value. But earlier on, we could just estimate the hands that aren't valued.
I think what I would probably recommend is think about it in terms of thresholds, right? Think about it in terms of what are the lower boundaries of the ranges that exist for value, and then what are in this case, you can look at it in terms of what is the threshold of hand where his hand is strong enough to check on the turn. Because I think part of the tricky aspect here is you did correctly recognize that a hand like pocket tens is probably right in that category that's almost always checking, right? So if you can evaluate where that threshold is for below a certain category of value, it's probably checking. And then once you go below that, once you get to the hands that don't have any kind of showdown value, now we can start to consider some of the bluffs that do exist. That's going to be helpful. But for the most part, the enumeration process, it needs to either be done in full, where we actually enumerate every hand that can be in the range, or it needs to be done in a sort of hand class based kind of a sense, but we have to account for how much of that hand class actually exists here, because not all hand classes are equal in terms of how often they occur within that range. Does that make sense?
And I think that doing it off table after the fact, I'm getting a little better at recording the hands, and doing it off the table and enumerating it with some accuracy as at least the value, but it's helping me realize a little bit more in game. It's still very hard for me in game because the pace of live poker goes so quickly that it's, as far as like you have a few seconds to act on a hand, and so I'm not really enumerating, but I'm getting better at understanding it, but it's just very hard to enumerate the value specifically in the hand.
Yeah, and you're not, this is the whole thing why I say that it's not always the best way to actually go through all the combos, especially on the earlier streets, because like you say, you simply don't really have time to do that. The only time when you really have time to do that is if you're sitting there tanking, thinking about a bluff catch on the river. So yeah, just thresholds are very useful here.
Great. Very instructive.
Cool. So hand number 8 here, this one's pretty simple. I think the only thing that's really worth talking about here is when you have 350 in your stack, you can't 4-bet to 150 here. You have to either 4-bet really small to 100 or shove. And there's a specific reason for that. Can you think of what the reason for that is here as to why we can't 4-bet to 150?
Why we can't 4-bet to 1?
Think about it from your opponent's perspective here, like from the perspective of either the under the gun or the middle position player. What are they thinking when you 4-bet to 150 here?
Ah, you lost me.
I lost you?
Yeah, I don't get the point.
Okay.
So when that particular size, when we 4-bet to 150, he's already invested 45. So it's an easy call for him.
Slow down for a second. Just try to think about it in terms of how do they perceive your range here? In fact, let's think of it even simpler. When you make it 150, do they ever think that you're bluffing here?
No.
No, absolutely not.
Ace king.
No, but ace king's not a bluff. That's the thing. The whole thing here is that when your stack is 350 and you make it 150, both these opponents and both of the players in the blinds as well, everybody at this table knows that if somebody shoves all in, there's no folding that's happening from you. You can never and will never fold to a shove if you make it 150, which immediately means that you can never be bluffing here. There's no possibility that they can ever perceive you to be getting out of line in some way with your 4-bet here. If you were to make it like 100, then it would still be pretty hard for them to perceive you to be bluffing, but it wouldn't be as difficult because at least making it 100 does not put you in a position where even your bluffs are priced into calling it off if you get shoved on. If you were to make it 150 with any kind of a bluff hand with, I don't know, ace 5 suited or something, you're just getting such a good price versus a shove that you can't even fold ace 5 suited here if you 4-bet to 150.
So explain again the thought process behind ace king though, because a lot of times at this level of play, they'll call off with pairs thinking that you have ace king.
Okay, so the thought process, the way you want to think about any kind of a hand when it comes to putting money in the pot pre-flop is that the hand is either benefiting from getting action from hands that it's dominating, or it's benefiting from folding out hands that are dominating it, right? And with ace king, there are no hands that are dominating ace king except for aces and kings, right? In theoretical terms, the reason why ace king 4-bets in situations like this so frequently is because you're supposed to get action from ace queen. It's supposed to be possible for you to get action from ace queen. And if a circumstance exists where you can't get action from ace queen, then the incentive to 4-bet ace king is pretty substantially reduced. But the key thing here is that one way or another, however much money you put in with ace king, which, I certainly think it would be reasonable to 4-bet ace king most of the time here. The price that you're getting once you get shoved on is just, it's good enough that you can never be in bad enough shape versus that shoving range to allow you to fold. So ace king is not a bluff in the sense that it's not going to fold to a 5-bet jam because it can't, right? It's getting too good of a price with all of this money in the pot at this point. So what I was going to lean towards here is it's actually pretty reasonable to have kind of two parts to your strategy here, which is you have a shoving range that's like queens, kings, ace king, maybe just queens and ace king, maybe pocket jacks even goes in there, hard to say. And then you might have a very small 4-bet, like a 4-bet to 100 or something like that, with just aces, kings, and then ace 5 suited or something like that. Aces, kings, and some kind of a bluff combo to take advantage of the folds that you might potentially get if you go really small there. But the general observation that I wanted to make here, regardless of what overall strategy that we employ here, is that the reason why we can't 4-bet to 150 is simply because it's never a bluff and everybody knows it's never a bluff. And that's always just going to make it harder for you to actually get action from the range of hands that you're 4-betting here, right? That's the main thing here. So all we want, even if you made it 125 here, that would be better than 150 because at least with 125, there's maybe some possibility that they could perceive that you would fold if they shove. But as soon as you make it close to half your stack here, this is, everybody knows you're not folding. And that just makes everything so much harder for you to get any kind of action. You see what I mean? Yeah.
So as played, we did get called.
Yeah. As played, it plays itself. Like you shove the flop, that's fine, whatever. There's not really anything to do differently here.
Okay.
You shove, he folds. You're at a tiny SPR here. So honestly, you actually pretty much should just shove this flop with every single hand in your range, because there's nothing in your range that can really play any other way at a tiny SPR here on this sort of a board. Even like ace king is basically just a value shove on this flop because your SPR is so low. So it doesn't really matter too much there.
So interesting enough, I don't know how much time we have left, but I do have a couple of ace king hands down the bottom that are very short.
Yeah, I'll get to those.
12 and 14.
I'll get to those for sure. So this one here, the ace jack offhand, this is actually okay. I don't think this is too wide. I think it's on the more aggressive side, but I think this 3-bet range here would be definitely too tight. And I'm glad that you didn't flick it in with this. And I think the 3-bet is actually fine. I think 80 is reasonable here. I think you're going to sometimes get some like, you might get ace queen off to fold here. You might get flatted by some queen jack suited type stuff sometimes. So it's a mergy sort of 3-bet, but I think this is okay. I don't think this is a
on the chart, on the software way pre-flop range charts, it looked a little bit wide.
That's not going to apply here because the open is 5x. Like the rake is different. Like those charts are just going to change a lot. And especially with the middle position call being probably very capped. Like the thing about it is the middle position call isn't supposed to exist here. So when they do call, you can be very confident that they're going to have hands that they shouldn't have, which is what makes the 3-bet probably more reasonable than it normally would be. We get 4-bet and we just fold, and that's fine. That's trivial. Like we don't have a hand that can continue there, so that's fine. I do want to talk about this ace jack hand at some point, but I don't think it's super crucial to talk about. I think generally your line is pretty good. The only thing that I would probably say as far as an important point here is that you mentioned this flop is not good for our range. It's not fantastic, but we do want to just be aware that the flops that are not good for our range as the pre-flop raiser are going to be the ones where an overpair is in trouble, so to speak. And that's not really going to apply to this board, right? We're going to be occasionally up against 2-pair here, but there's no straight. There's just a bunch of draws. Jack 8 off probably isn't in either player's range. 8-6 off probably isn't in there. So really, we're just looking at a few combos of suited 2-pairs, and even Jack 6 suited probably isn't in there either. It's not really that bad of a flop at all. Like you want to think a lot about how many 2-pairs and stuff villains can have, and I think this is a pretty good flop. So other than that, I think your logic is good. I think everything here is pretty reasonable. We bet the turn for 100 here. I think that's all good. And then we check back the river. That's all seems pretty reasonable too. The queen's hand, this one is, I think it's fine. It's whatever. Like we probably don't need to re-raise here. Once we sort of trap here, I think we can just call and just keep all those other hands in, but it doesn't really matter too much. There is a spinning
on that particular hand, was that I'm just trying to, you're going through the hands very quickly. So what hand number is that?
It's just hand number 11. 11,
yeah. So is that, we have queens. Yeah, that's,
yeah.
So yeah, what I've been doing is multi-way. I just want to run it by you, especially in position. I don't know if I'm in position here.
Yeah, you are. The bet's into
just you. Not raising in position. Unless we're super deep, I'm not raising because there's a third player in, and it's like an old thought process that I don't want to raise there and get rid of the third person, but that's what I've been doing.
Yeah, I think that's fine. I think it's like, it can go either way here, right? When you re-raise to 145, I think really the only thing that I would say here is that this is a bit like that pre-flop spot a second ago, is that when the effective stack is 285 and you raise to 145, everybody knows it's not a bluff, right? So if you're gonna re-raise here, just jam, right? Either call or just jam. Don't put in half of the effective stack.
So why is the jam less of a bluff?
The jam has more fold equity, first of all, and the jam can come from hands like draws that are just looking to be all in and to realize their equity. It's not so much that the jam. The way to look at it is it's not so much that the jam is more of a bluff, so to speak. It's that specifically, one way or another, the 145 is essentially equivalent to a jam, because no matter what you raise with to this size, you're never folding to a jam anyway. So the only impression your opponents can get here is that your hand is actually so strong that you don't just want to shove all in and maximize fold equity, but in fact, you would prefer for them to shove all in. Like, you're really trying to get as much action as possible here. You would never actually make it 145 here with a draw. If you had a strong draw, you would just shove. So you just want to look at, if I have value, I want to make sure that I play it the same way that I would when I have some kind of a draw. If I have a draw, I want to make sure I play it the same way I would when I have value. So
that's just a jam there.
Yeah, so I think you could just jam. You could equally make an argument for maybe I don't jam anything and I just make it to 145 with my draws, but your draws do want to jam here. So you don't really have to min raise. Like, you can either call or jam here. It doesn't really matter a ton. Like, you have a set, like, it's not really going to change much. So the ace king hand here, the only thing I would say about this one is the 3-bet's too small. Ace king off, making it 75 here from out of position.
Yeah, it should be 100.
Is too small. 100, 125, something like that would be pretty good. We get clicked back.
Very suspicious.
Suspicious, but not completely. Like, this is a pretty, if this player is a reg, like, this is a good spot for him to have some kind of a 4-bet non-all-in range. You certainly, I think, at 200, with the amount of money that's in the pot, with 600 in stacks, like, you certainly can shove here over this 4-bet. You're going to be doing fine by jamming here. Heads up, ace king suited is a pure jam. However, having both middle position and cutoff to act behind, both ace king off.
That's at 100 big blinds.
Yeah, I think the main thing here is that with the middle position and the cutoff player, are we talking about? I'm confused about what you're talking about here, because middle position and cutoff to act behind, the middle position player is the middle position player is the 4-better. So the cutoff is the only player who's left to act behind, and the cutoff is really capped here. So it doesn't really matter. I think you're actually fine to jam here pre-flop, but calling is also fine. And then check folding here. Yeah, it's going to be close. If you had ace king with backdoor flush draw, you wouldn't fold this flop, but he does bet 1/3, which is probably a little bigger than he actually needs to bet. So I don't hate check folding here. This is okay.
So if we skip to 14, that's another ace king hand.
Okay.
And this one here, after the fold, I got a 15-minute lecture from the button. I need a little reassurance here, okay?
Yeah, okay.
Just take a look at
this. Yeah, this is totally standard. There's absolutely nothing you can do differently here. This is
okay.
This
that's what I
1000% the best play every single time.
I missed the short stack in the big blind, and the guy keeps yelling, he's never folding there. He's never folding there. It's like, this guy is a short stack. He's calling in the big blind. He's really weak. I'm surprised he has ace king there. I really want to play a hand with him. And as it were, I wanted to get the button off because he was closer to, he had me covered. So I bet there. And we luckily folded nines, like he was going to call off with nines there. And because he knows I have ace king, but I'm like, why didn't you call it? You have nines.
He doesn't know you have ace king. Whatever, like, this is just such a trivial spot. There's $80 of complete dead money in there. Like, you're less than 100 deep. Yeah, we make it 10.
Yeah.
Raise, call. This is just a great spot to just shove ace king.
Yeah.
I would shove a lot of hands here. I'd shove like 10s, jacks, ace, queen suited probably. There's just a bunch of hands that can shove because you're getting such a good price. You're risking, there's 130 in the pot, and you're risking another 290 to win it. Like, you're only risking just over 2x pot, which is a pretty small amount to shove. Like, it's really not that big of a shove. So this is actually pretty trivial. The only other thing that I wanted to really talk about here is this hand. And I think the main focus that I would take in this hand with Jack 10 suited is the open is obviously completely fine. All the analysis in terms of the player's ranges is pretty fine. But what I want to hone in on is this is not a good board for our range. What was it that made you think this is not a good board for your range?
Let me just reread the hand really quickly, because it's a single raise pot. I get called by the middle position, the button. And then the flop is the 7 connects to his calling range, each player's calling range. It's not, we don't really have, we have an overpair advantage, I don't think. And we have sets of 7s as well. It just doesn't, I don't think it's a board that we're betting range on. I just didn't think it was an advantage board for us.
Okay.
I know it is paired, low pair.
I think you're correct that we probably can't easily bet range here, simply because we are first to act of 3 players. But in the grand scheme of things, if we compared every board texture here, 7 deuce is very good for us.
Okay.
Our betting frequency here is going to be about as high as it ever would be in a spot like this. And in particular, the noteworthy thing here is that neither player ever has a deuce here. That's the reason why we're so good on this board, is that our overpairs, if we do have like aces, kings, queens, a really good way to look at how to evaluate flops is how comfortable are those big overpairs playing a big pot on this board. And on this board, they're very comfortable because they just don't really ever run into a deuce, right? If you have aces, you're very happy to just put in a bunch of money here because the frequency that you lose is very low, right? It's exclusively ace deuce suited really, and maybe a couple of other combos that can occasionally exist for players that are on the wider side. But in general, we're very happy to put money in the pot here with those strong overpairs. Now, that may not be the case with some of the middle overpairs, like eights or something. Those eights, nines, tens, like those hands are not going to be as strong as aces, kings, or queens here, obviously, because they're a bit more vulnerable. But in general, if we have aces and we see this board, we should be very happy because this board is extremely blank. And yeah, our opponents can have a 7 sometimes, but being able to have a 7 doesn't really mean that much here, right, because they still lose to all of our strong overpairs. So
yeah, I'm looking at this board like 6, 7, 8.
Yeah, and it's
low board, and it's
drastically
really
different from that. It's completely
it's 7
different.
blind.
Right. 6, 7, 8 would be significantly worse because that would be a board where there's 3 available sets for both opponents, a straight, 2 straights, in fact, and a bunch of 2 pairs that are available. So this board here, if you look at every board in terms of how confident are the overpairs on this board, like that's a pretty decent barometer there of how big of a pot you're going to be able to play and how good the board is. And in this case, because we just almost never run into a deuce, this is really good. Now, this would actually be slightly worse if it was 7-7 deuce, because that would mean there would be more trips hands in both ranges. It wouldn't be that much trips, but it would certainly be more than a board with a deuce on it, right? But even 7-7 deuce would be pretty good because trips is rare. And 7 deuce, really any like low card board with 2 deuces, anything that's like jack deuce deuce, 10 deuce deuce, 9 deuce, all that stuff, those boards are really good for us as the pre-flop raiser because we just have all those strong overpairs that villain never has.
And the cards, the deuces never connect to his board.
Exactly. So you always want to start your evaluation of the flop by thinking about the strongest hands, the categories at the top. So in this case, it's full houses, which, yeah, players can have them very rarely, very occasionally. But trips here is very rare for anybody. And therefore, the overpairs and the fact that we can have all those aces and kings and queens and the other players can't really, that's a big determining factor here. So that the only thing that's really off about this one is it's actually a much better board than you might think. I don't think it's bad to check call Jack 10 suited here. I think this is completely okay. We turn a flush and we check call, and that's okay as well.
It's a cooler.
The river is where I would start to say we have to really be conscious of this, right? Because you mentioned middle position has quads, deuces, flushes, like half of which we beat. The problem here is the flushes that we beat. First of all, what are they? Like eight high flushes, 10 high flushes. So they can't have 10 high flushes. So we have the 10, right? So 8 high flushes, which would be 8-6 of clubs, 8-5 of clubs. Do they have those hands? Probably not. Then we've got 6 high flushes, which is 6-5. We do beat that. But is 6-5 of clubs going to jam the river? Probably not when there's four clubs out there, right? Is 4-5 of clubs going to jam the river? Probably not when there's 4 clubs out there. In fact, I don't think we ever see a jam from a worse flush here. I think the hands that jam here are better flushes, full houses, and potentially whatever kind of bluffs do exist. But I actually think there's very few easily attributable bluffs on this board that we can put in villain's range. So I think the river here is where we actually have to start thinking quite seriously about, do we actually have enough equity to call based on the fact that we have I guess not even the 4th nuts here on the river because there's full houses out there. So flop and turn, totally reasonable.
What
totally
about
fine.
The turn? You see the note about can I raise here?
Yeah, it depends on what if you're going to raise, the only size you can raise to is a jam. So it just depends on what type of hands do we think that we can really get called by. And I think jam would be okay. It would be completely feasible there. There are some worse flushes out there on this turn, certainly. There's also, if we think that there's a potential for the occasional overpair, if we do think like pocket nines with a club, pocket eights with a club can take this line potentially, that's going to be to our benefit to shove there. So you can shove the turn. The other thing that I would mention though is the call is not close. You have a flush. This is way too strong of a hand to even consider folding at this point, because there's such a small region of hands that you lose to in terms of full houses, and you block a good chunk of the better flushes. In fact, to be honest, like you mentioned that we have to pay to fade a possible full house. I think you lose to a better flush much more often than you lose to a full house here.
Yeah, he only has nines, sixes and threes.
Nines isn't a full house until the river. On the turn, he only has sevens. He doesn't even necessarily have all of pocket threes, because we don't know for sure that threes is going to bet this flop for 25 here. So in the end, I think running into ace five of clubs or king queen of clubs is more of a concern here than running into a full house. But I still think we're fine jamming the turn, but calling is fine too. It's going to be close. It's not really going to matter a ton. I think the main decision point that matters here is the river, and also just the analysis that the flop is not great because the flop is actually really good. So check calling this hand is fine. Betting would be fine too. The river is the sort of the part that's a bit tricky here. We are getting a very good price, but it could easily be the case that we really only win very rarely here. It could easily be that we win, I don't know, 10% of the time or something. Our hand is definitely a bluff catcher by the time we get the river.
So this was nowhere near a cooler.
It's a cooler in the sense that you lost with the flush to a full house. Yeah, it's a cooler until the river. The flop and turn are like, yeah, it's fine. Sometimes you're just going to lose flush to full house, but I could completely understand if let's say we looked at the river here and we arrived at the decision that I think it's close. My hand is a bluff catcher, but I think villain is bluffing enough to make this good. I would have said, okay, yeah, it's close. I think that's reasonable. But the fact that the main thing here is that we established what villain's range was, and we put hands in there that are actually very low frequency, like threes here. We don't know for sure. Threes bets the flop. And then particularly thinking that villain would jam the river with worse flushes. It's really hard for that to happen. It's really hard for those to exist, first of all. And it's very hard for them to jam those hands if they do exist, because something like 6-5 of clubs is unlikely to see that fourth club and then think, oh, I can still jam. I think you're right that there's not a lot of bluffs, but there's also the value range is a bit different. That's the thing here. So yeah, definitely not a disaster hand by any means. I think the main sort of hand to be mindful of here is probably the Jack 10 off hand that we looked at first. And I think the primary sort of adjustment there is we don't want to really get too creative pre-flop in an environment like this, simply because the rake is high enough and the stacks are shallow enough that even if your opponent is like an absolute super fish at 75 big blinds with an offsuit Broadway hand, you just can't really do a lot. It just isn't a particularly ideal situation to start expanding. And then obviously once we get into the post-flop sort of portion of the hand, I think that if we can't call this river, it certainly indicates that, villain is probably not playing in a way where pre-flop is going to work out particularly great. And then we obviously want to just be cautious that in game, we don't have to do this enumeration process. But if we are going to do it post game, we have to just either be very specific about the exact hands and how often they show up in the range. Or if we're going to do it category wise, we want to make sure that we account for any kind of uncertainty or lower level of confidence that exists here, because we can be very confident that queen 10 suited is in range, but we can be significantly less confident that top pair, weak kicker, weak pair, that type of stuff is in the range.
Okay.
Makes sense?
Yes. So just to wrap up, how do you foresee us moving forward?
So I think I would just continue with this pattern for now, because I think this is really highlighting a lot of the areas where there are some blind spots.
I hate hand history so much.
I think it's probably a combination of things. I think it's because I would imagine you've gotten pretty comfortable with sim outputs over the years, but I also think that looking at a lot of sim outputs has ingrained a lot of bad habits, and it's ingrained a lot of habits that kind of, to put it in a simple way, things that kind of feel good but aren't actually winning. Things like, I'm going to call wider because this guy's tight passive, so I'm going to outplay him. It feels like that would be a natural adaptation here, but there's a blind spot about the fact that you're playing 1-2. The rake is really high. The stacks are pretty short. The range is under the gun. And all of those things, when you combine them, it just means that this consideration is not even really an option here. So we're tackling blind spots right now. We're tackling these aspects of your game that for a long time have been overlooked because you haven't been looking at hand histories. And even just this simple factor here, like the kind of reversing or the inverting of the pot odds, this is the kind of thing that truthfully, this should be corrected before you ever look at a solver for the first time. And the fact that you have gotten way deep in.
I know all this stuff, but I
Sure.
totally reversed it in my mind. I'm just
Right.
totally
And what we want.
bringing out the tool bag, and I'm just using the wrong end of the hammer.
Sure. And I think this is what we're addressing here. It's that you have all these tools in your toolkit, but because you haven't basically ever gotten into a process of reviewing hand histories, it's almost like you're not actually, you're very regularly picking the wrong tool, and you don't even have that process for how to pick the right tool fully fleshed out. So that's what we're doing here. That's what we're reinforcing. And I can already see various things evolving and changing. So we're doing the right things. We're getting on the right path here, and we're tackling things that are making an impact. I can tell. But
right, I'm running very good.
Okay,
really.
that's good.
Right where I'm supposed to be this month, and last month I'm almost where I'm supposed to be. But
sure.
It's just,
either way, we don't want to take account of that too much. We just want to think about the quality of the decisions that we're making. And I think in general, we're continuing to close up blind spots here. We're closing up some of these different, parts of your game where certain things have been maybe overlooked. And there's plenty of good hands coming in here. We've got this ace jack hand. Like, this is completely reasonable, very logical, very good. If anything, I think what happened here was because you got 4-bet, you started to convince yourself that this was a bad 3-bet, but this is a completely fine 3-bet, right? So we got to be really careful. We don't evaluate based on outcomes there. So yeah, I think that a lot of this stuff is completely good. This multi-way analysis here was very reasonable all around here, other than just maybe slightly underestimating how good the flop is. So all of this, very logical, very reasonable. So everything is heading in the right directions. We just want to
encouraging.
Continue to iron out these blind spots. Yeah. Cool.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah.
Have a good
Sounds good. Talk to you then. See ya. Bye-bye.